Oh gosh, I don't want to be yawning when we have the picture on.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started.
Ask the questions.
And so, Grammy, will you start off just by telling us your full name and where you're from? And we can get into family history after that.
Where I was born and all that jazz. My full name is Myrtle Hannibal Kabelitz. Kabelitz. The Germans call it Kabelitz. Of course, in America, we say Kabelitz.
Farrell.
And then later on, when I got married, I married a Farrell. Married Frank Harding Farrell. He and I.
Well, wait, start off with the history, the my great-grandfather, your grandfather.
My grandfather's name was Otto Kabelitz. That's all I remember. Otto was his name, Kabelitz. And he married Hannah. He was Admiral Dewey's coxswain.
He was in the Navy.
That was in the Navy.
What do you remember about him?
Well, I think the last time I saw him, I must have been about 7 years old or something like that. See, don't remember too much.
But he married Hannah, so what about her? Did you ever meet her?
Yes, I saw her too when I saw him. And
where did he meet her?
Mom, we don't want to lead her into the questions because we want to hear her talk about it. So, instead of saying like you met Hannah, tell us about her, say, well, so who was he married to? Can you tell us about her?
Okay, yeah. Tell us what you know about who he married.
Well, Hannah, during his service, his fleet was stationed in Japan somewhere, and he married this Japanese woman, Hannah. That's all I know, it's Hannah. And then he brought her to China. That's when I remember I saw him and her together. And then my Aunt Bertha and Aunt Martha. Aunt Bertha was alone at that time. I think her husband had passed away, but he was an American from Detroit, Michigan. And Aunt Martha, this younger daughter, married a officer in the Navy, an American officer in the Navy. His name was Eberhart. And they had one child, a boy, Alan. And of course, I didn't get to see them much. I think I just saw them once at my grandfather's house because she had to go away wherever his ship was stationed, I guess.
They were moving a lot.
Pardon?
They were moving around a lot.
I suppose, yes, they did. Anyway,
Just gonna adjust your sweater there.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. anyway, Aunt Bertha, as I told you, was married to this American fellow. He was in Detroit, Michigan, and then that's where my youngest uncle ended up in Detroit after he graduated from USC in California. He went to Detroit, lived there, stayed there, never left it, and then he married, and they had a girl. And both Uncle John and his wife, they have now, of course, passed away, and his daughter still lives there alone. And my cousin, Aunt Martha's son, whose father was in the Navy, Martha and, of course, the husband also have passed away. And my cousin, Alan Eberhardt, he died just a couple of years ago. Now, that's all of my family that I know of. Oh, my mother, excuse me, my mother, my mother's father and mother were Portuguese, and she had 2 brothers, and I had met them years ago, and they went out of our lives and I never heard from them anymore. And that's that. And I have one brother who now lives in Long Beach, California, and my mother ended up living there, and she passed away about, I would say, 15 years ago now. And she never got in touch with the 2 brothers, don't know where they went, whatever. That's it. The only family we have is are my 2 girls and me, and my brother who is in California, and he has 1 son, and the son's wife, and he has 2 daughters, and that's it. That's my family.
Real quick, you said they were that you have Portuguese relatives. Was that from Portugal or like from Brazil?
No, all I know is that my mother's father, my grandfather, was in Macau, I think. Macau. A lot of Portuguese ended up in Macau from Portugal. And I don't know any more about what part of Portugal he came from. His name was Lorenzo Senna, Senna, and his wife's name was Juanita. That's all I know about that. Okay. And my mother's name was Theodora.
Okay, that sounds good. What do you have next there, Mom?
Well, did Dora was part of her family from Macau?
They were from Macau, and they ended up in China, Shanghai, China.
How did that happen?
Macau, China.
No, Macau was in China, but they ended up in Shanghai.
A lot of the Portuguese came to Macau?
Yeah, apparently. Mm-hmm. And so, my brother and I were born in Shanghai.
And you have...
What year was that?
I was born in August 22nd, 1920. And my brother's 2 years younger than I. Mm-hmm.
How long did you stay in Shanghai for?
I stayed there until 1945, after the Second War. Went to school there. Went to a British school there, right? It's a very funny thing. It turned out that the school I went to had British teachers and one American teacher, and her name was Myrtle Eubanks, Miss Myrtle Eubanks, and that's something. And she was from the South in the States, and she went there and taught. And we had British teachers, and in fact, we took French there in that school, and the teacher was a French woman from France.
Messed up.
Oh,
Okay. Will you tell us a little bit about your sister?
my sister's name was Gloria Elaine Kabelitz. I was the oldest of us three. I was 2 years older than my brother, and I think that I was, I think, about 7. My brother was 5, and I think she was about 3. Yeah, that's how it went. 3. And she got the scarlet fever, and she died.
Was there a lot of that going around?
I had no idea, nothing. I knew nothing about anything like that that happened, but
Tell us a little bit more about your family and growing up in Shanghai and what that was like.
Oh,
Kind of, I guess, outsiders, or was there a large community of?
oh, in Shanghai there was a large community of Americans. They had a beautiful club, and there were a lot of French people. There was also a beautiful French club. They had lovely dances that I remember. I was a teenage girl, and I did go out with a group, and there were a lot of Russians there. The white Russians that fled Russia when the Red Russians came in there, you know, and they fled into China and Shanghai. A lot of them stopped in Tientsin. That's another town that's north of Shanghai, near Russia, I suppose. But a lot of them ended up in Shanghai, and there were a lot of Germans in Shanghai, and British. There's a lot of British there. The Americans had companies there, the Texaco Company, and Occidental Life Insurance Company was there, and then the British had companies there. It was international. They used to call it the Paris of the East.
What about, she has
And
tennis club, horse races?
oh, there was a what did they call it? The horse races. Yes, I knew people who were members of the race course. They called it the race course. And I would be invited there, and I didn't go to college because my mother and father divorced when I was about, I guess must have been about 11 years old, and he went off, and my mother had to work and take care of my brother and me, and so there was no money for college. But I went to a business school and learned shorthand and typing, and I became a secretary, and met different people that way.
Need some water?
Excuse me. Sip.
What was like your house like and your living when you grew up in Shanghai?
Yeah.
Oh.
After they like before they divorced?
Before they divorced, we had nice houses. And of course, we had a maid to clean the house. And in fact, we had another maid, a female cook, who cooked. And we had tailors that made clothes for us. We just couldn't. There was a department store in Shanghai that was a British department store. And of course, they had other department stores. They were owned by Chinese, but they carried all kinds of goods and clothing from America and Britain and wherever. And but as I grew up, I had my clothes made especially by tailors for me, and I always dressed well, always did. Anyway, so I worked for the American Express. I got a job there, and I worked, it was a small little office, but I worked for the big boss of that office. And then I met a girl there who ran the directory, telephone directory. And through her, I met her uncle, who was a member of the race course. And he probably owned a horse that the jockeys, various different people were jockeys. And there was another British fellow who was a jockey, and he was a jockey for some wealthy Chinese who had horses there, and they'd race around. And they also had tennis clubs there. And my father worked for the British American Tobacco Company, BAT. They had a little tennis club there. I remember playing tennis there. This is after I grew up, But then, strange thing, my father left when I was 11. But because he had worked there, I was able to join the club and play tennis there. But anyway, what else?
So that was kind of a change from, I guess, upper class living to where after the divorce, your mother had to work.
Well, I still continued to. I went to work then, you see, old enough to work and help with after my mother and father divorced, of course, she had to get just little apartments for my brother and me. Couldn't afford to keep a house anymore. Well, anyway, so, and then...
what did your brother and you do for work?
Well, I was a secretary.
Where
at? In Shanghai.
For what company?
I worked for the American Express. Okay. Remember I told you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. And the funny thing was in the race course where I met this girl at the American Express, and her uncle who was a member of the race course, and she was invited, and she took me with her. And there I met an American fellow. His name was P.M. Anderson, or F.M. Anderson, something like that. He ran the Occidental Life Insurance Company in Shanghai. And so we became friends, because I was a little younger than he. But still, anyway, met him at the race course when they had races, and so on and so forth. And then the war came along. And
what kind of changes did that bring?
yes, well, the American companies had to close, British companies had to close, and then the Americans all evacuated and came to the States. And my father had come to the States, but we were left there. My mother, because she was Portuguese, the Portuguese government took care of her, and she continued to work. Anyway, she was a Roman Catholic and went to a Roman Catholic school. She wasn't equipped to hold any kind of job, and she worked like in a department store, that kind of work she did. And then, yes, and so, and then when the war, Americans had to evacuate, we couldn't evacuate.
Well, yeah, that brings up a interesting concept of, I guess, your status and citizenship.
Yes.
Being in Shanghai with a Portuguese mother and American father.
And because we did not come to the States, my brother and I, we had no citizenship. You see? Apparently, it turns out, I learned much, much later that a child of American parents born out of the States, when he or she reached the age of 13, had to come to the States, otherwise she lost her citizenship, which happened to my brother and me. We had no citizenship because we did not come back here when we reached the age of 13 or something like that. So, but anyway, then the war came, and I couldn't work for the American Express anymore. They were closed. I worked for the municipal council, and as a secretary still. And it was run by, the British had to leave that. It was run by the British before, but then the Japanese ran it because the Japanese took over Shanghai then. And but still we continued and living and not suffering too much at all. And then when the war ended and the Americans won the war, they came back to Shanghai. And there were some Americans still there. And I went to see them at the American consulate and told them that my father was in the States and I wanted to come to the States. But I did not have a passport. And the funny thing was, it turned out that after the war, when the Americans came into the city, the Americans had won the war, there was a Korean fellow whose parents, Korean, they were Americans. And he joined the U.S. Army. And he came back he worked for the American consulate, and he was getting the people on an American liner, a ship, to take the Americans back home, the ones who were left there. And he knew me, and I told him, I said that, my father is there, and I want to go. I don't have a passport. And there was a Chinese girl who spoke good English, and she remembered me. She said, "We'll put your name down anyway. Put your name down on the top of the list." And so he said to me, "But what if you get to the States and you can't get off the ship?" I said, "Well, I would have had a nice trip, wouldn't I?" So by golly, when the ship came, I got on it and we sailed. And before we arrived in San Francisco, a launch came out and brought the immigration officers on the boat, on the ship. It was like 4 in the morning or something like that, so they could get things all taken care of by the time we landed. And when they got to me and I had no passport, and I told them, I said, well, my father's here. And the guy says, oh, I'll put you down. Sure. Put me down. And when I landed in San Francisco, I got down on my knees and I kissed the ground. And there was a girl on the boat there that I knew from before, and she was a Chinese girl, but she was, I think, adopted by Americans up here. So, I mean, she spoke good English, went to British school there, and she had married this American Marine, he was. And of course, he had to go away, and she had a child by him, and she brought him. And so anyway, she and I were on the boat together, and we left together, and I was put out, they got a room for me in the Y, and she and I would have been in the same room, but her husband and his mother came to meet her and took him away, and took the daughter away, and took her away. But his mother took her place in the room that we were scheduled, and I had to sleep with his mother. And it was in one bed, big bed, and I never knew the woman before, and I had to sleep there. Didn't matter, I went to sleep. I was young enough I could sleep. And the next day, I was in touch with my father. I had his address, and I got in touch with him that I was in San Francisco, and so he told me to come down by train. He'd meet me, and I did. I met him, and he put me in a hotel, and he told me, he said, we'll stay here for a while and see what happens. He said, get on the bus and ride up and down town so you can get to know the streets, you know? And so I did that the next day probably. And we came, this is in Los Angeles, and we came to a street, red light, and we stopped in that street, and I looked over and I saw this big sign on that building, Occidental Life Insurance Company. I thought, oh my gosh, that's P.M. Anderson. He worked there in Shanghai. He ran the big office down there. So I got off the bus and I ran down the block and went into the building, and I looked up the board, the list, and by golly, I saw his name up there, P.M. Anderson. So I went up there and came into this office, and there was a secretary there, and I gave her my card. We had a thing in Shanghai, all the young working people had little cards printed, you know? So I gave her my card, and she took the card to the office, private office. He had a private office, his own room, and he came flying out of the room, and he hugged me because he remembered me from the race course days in Shanghai. And he took me to his office, and he shut the door. The door was always shut. And he sat me by the desk, and he opened the bottom drawer of the desk, and he brought out a bottle of wine or something, and he poured me some, and he took some, and we drank it. He knew my story, that I had no passport, and he said, how did you get here? How in the world did you get here? But anyway, and so he says, what are you going to do now? And I said, well, I want to get a job right away. I have to, because if I want to live. So he said, oh, we'll get you a job here. So after we had our little visit, he took me down to the main office, I guess, and sure enough, there was a space that I could take, a secretarial job for a department. There were many departments. There's lots of floors in this building and very many departments. And I got a boss, and he had 2 men agents working under him. And I took care of the 3 of them, dictation and typing and whatnot. And so I got that job, and it was fine. It worked out fine. I was
How old were you when you came over on the boat?
1945, 24.
So how many years had it been since you had seen him last?
Seen who last?
P and
Oh, well, I was 24. The war only lasted, what, 2 years or 3 years? 2 years. Couple of years, that was it.
Did you speak Chinese or Japanese?
I spoke Chinese a little, but I don't remember one word. Would you believe? I don't remember one word. Well, I spoke Chinese, I spoke enough for the servants, you know? Mm-hmm. And that was it. And so, now where was I? Oh, yes.
Let's take a break for 1 second.
Yes. Sure.
He's setting it up again.
We are recording, so whenever you're ready, you can tell us.
Okay. After I got my job at the Occidental Life Insurance Company, one day I was in the elevator with P.M. Anderson, and there was a young woman in there, and he said, "Okay, I want you to meet Marge." I called myself Marge because when I went to high school, and the smart-ass kids used to call me Myrtle the Turtle, and then it went from that to Moidle the Toidle. And after that, it was just Moidle or Toidle. And so when I graduated from school and I started working, I went to Marge because I looked like my Aunt Marge, I guess. They used to call me Little Margie. So I went to Marge, and I've been called Marge ever since. I was going to legally change it, but I never got to doing it. So legally, I am Myrtle, but I'm known as Marge. So anyway, in the elevator, PM said, "Kay, I want you to meet Marge. She's from China. And this is Kay Booth, Marge. I want you to meet. She's a nice girl. She works on the other floor below us, blah, blah." And so Kay and she used to check with me every day, and we'd have coffee together or something, have lunch together or something. And after several months of that, she also invited me to her. She lived with her mother and father because she was married and her husband was overseas in the war. And then after I was there for about a year, she told me one day her husband had returned from service, and also a very good friend of her family's. And she said, "He's a very nice fellow. His name is Frank Farrell. I'm going to give him your name and he'll call you." And I told her, I said, "Kay, I don't like these blind dates." She said, "This one will be okay." She said, "We've known each other ever since we were little kids." So
she was the daughter of who?
Kay Booth of Spain,
Catherine.
Mrs. Spain, Catherine Spain, and Hazel Harding, Frank's mother, were very good friends. They were neighbors, and Kay and Frank were neighbors for years and years, I suppose, grew up a lot together. But anyway, so she gave him my name, a number at the office, and he called me at the office, and I said, "Okay, come on over." It was Saturday. He'd come by Saturday morning about 11 or 10 or something. Well, I was in my room upstairs. I had a front Oh, and how I got to stay in that room was that I went to the YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, and there was a lady there who knew a woman who rented rooms to girls. So I got the lady's name, and that's how I got to get a room in this woman, this old widow's house in Los Angeles. I got a room there, and there were other girls who lived in the house too. And this Saturday morning, this man comes out of the car, a young man, Frank Farrell, and I looked and I thought, oh, wow, he's good looking. And he, of course, rang the doorbell, and he was allowed in, and they called me, and I came down, and we went in his car, and we drove down to the beach close by there in Santa Monica, and they had, they had those, what do you call those playgrounds where they had the Ferris wheels and all these merry-go-rounds and galleries and so on and so forth. He took me there, and
Is it like a boardwalk or a carnival or a
carnival, something, whatever you call it. What was the other name besides fair?
Boardwalk?
Amusement park?
Amusement park, yes, it was there. And so we went from one booth to the other, and we had lunch there and everything. And then shortly after the middle in the afternoon, he took me home. And the next Saturday came. See, he lived in Long Beach, and I'm in Los Angeles. So he took all that trip way down. And then the next weekend he came again, and this time we had dinner somewhere. He came later in the day, and then the next time he came, I don't know after a couple of months or so, he invited me to Long Beach. His father died when he was overseas, and so he was living with his mother, and I went with him. I was a guest and overnight at his mother's apartment where he shared with his mother. And then it was about a block away from the beach in Long Beach, and we'd go to the beach. And it was after work on Friday nights, he'd pick me up and take me back to Long Beach, and we had all Saturday, and Sunday night he'd bring me back to my apartment so I could get ready for work on Monday. And this went on for a long while.
How did y'all commute? Did he have a car?
He had a car.
What kind of car did he
I don't remember cars. Don't forget I was from China and we didn't bother about cars. I don't remember what kind of car he drove, but he had a car. But I did not drive. And so,
Was he still in service?
No, he was out of the war when I met him. That's when Kay Booth's husband also came out of the service, discharged after the war. And then, let's see, and then it was after we were dating like that for I was 25 when I met him, 28. 3 years later we married. But before that, the county health department sent their van out, and they checked every floor in our building, and everyone had to be interviewed or something, have their chest x-rayed. They were checking for tuberculosis or something. And a week later, I got a call, and they said that I had a spot on my right apex of my lung, my right lung, and I had to be sent to a sanatorium. I forget the name of the sanatorium. I was there. And they kept checking me, and all kinds of tests. And I went in there in April, and the next April came. I was not in the infirmary because I wasn't infirm. I was put in a little, we call it a cottage. There were 4 rooms. There were 4 of us girls in there, and we shared the cottage. And we were able, there was another little building where they had a movie once a week, and we were allowed to walk from our cottage to that little room, the other, ours was like a bungalow, really. And then the larger cottage was where they had the movie and meetings and so on. But anyway, I was there for April, and I was discharged in September. That was 17 months later. And they told me in the office that I could go. They said everything was fine. Then nothing positive ever came out of any of my tests. And so when Frank came to see me every Sunday. He worked all week, and Saturday was his time to take care of things at home, I guess, for his mother. And he came to see me every Sunday for 17 months. Anyway, and my mother came to see me too. And the thing was that I forgot to tell you that my mother and brother came to the States afterwards, after I came, right after the war. But this is 45, 46, 47. And 47, 48. So Frank came, and I told him, I said, I want you to go and live your life now. And forget about me, because I have been discharged from this sanatorium. I'm okay, and I'm going to get a job around here, and I want you to go on and live your life. And he says, I'm not going to do any such thing. He said, I'm going to pack your things with you and take you down to my place, my mother's place. And I'm going to marry you, period. And so we went down, and it turned out that he and I decided we were going to elope, because my mother, being alone, didn't have the money to give me a wedding, and his mother was alone and wouldn't want to give him a rehearsal dinner. You know, what is the groom's people, they give him a dinner and then the bride's people give them the wedding. And so he says, we'll elope and get married ourselves. So we did that. He and I got married. We went off to Santa Barbara, and he got a motel there. And right next to Santa Barbara is a little town called Montecito. And off we went. There was this Presbyterian church there. And before we went there, pardon?
Okay, where was the church at?
Montecito. Montecito, Montecito.
Okay.
And before we came up there, of course, we got our license, you see, to be married. And we went to this Presbyterian church, and the minister there said he would marry us. Frank asked him, and his wife would be the witness. And we got married there. And then we came back, and I moved into his apartment, and his mother and I and he. And finally, his buddy and the buddy's wife, we'd see each other often. She had heard about this woman who had this apartment quadruplex, 4 apartments, and one of the apartments is vacant now. So she took me to look at it, and I liked it. It was a 1-bedroom apartment, and I told Frank about it, and he went to look at it, and he says, okay. Told his mother, we're moving, which was good because she was such a bore. And we stayed in the apartment ourselves, and she would not allow any drinking in her apartment. And Frank liked to drink, being in the service, my gosh. And so we were able to drink our drinks in the apartment where we lived, and we could have our friends over and serve drinks and so on and so forth. And then we bought a house. Found a woman who was selling houses, and we bought this 3-bedroom ranch in Long Beach, California. I think it was $10,000 in those days. And we had to borrow a couple of $1,000s from his mother for the down payment. Frank didn't have that money because, well, he was in the service all the time. And so after he got married, I got a job so he could pay his mother off. Bang. And we only lived there for a year when he was, he worked for the Bethlehem Steel Company in Los Angeles, and a salesman with Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Sales Corporation used to come to sell fire bricks to steel companies, and he got to be friendly with Frank. And he suggested to Frank, why don't you give this job up and come with us, and you could sell bricks to steel companies. And Frank majored in metallurgy. That's why he was working for the steel company. It's all about making steel, metal. Anyway.
Where did he go to school?
Why don't we...
Stanford University.
Why don't we take a second and maybe go back and you can tell us kind of what you know of his history and where he grew up
And his mom, so.
Right.
where he went to school before you met him.
And the French, and the
Oh, wait a second.
President Harding.
You know, you read the story about President Harding.
Right.
I never knew about it until you read him. I knew he was a president, but didn't know any more.
1 second.
Something happened.
I think I have to run to the girls' room.
Okay, it's a good time to do it.
I
All
was
right.
just trying to figure out technical issue. I'll
Good.
take you to the girls' room. Do you need your cane?
Kane. Got to do this first, then this, then this. Okay. All right.
Okay, if you will, just tell us y'all got married, where you got married. And
We got married in Montecito, and then of course we went back to his mother's place. But soon after that we met a woman a real estate woman who had a little ranch house that she was selling, and we looked at it and we liked it and we bought it. And the thing was that it needed $2,000 to put down. It was a $10,000 house, and we needed a down payment of $2,000 and maybe $3,000, but Frank only had $1,000, so he borrowed $2,000 from his mother. And we moved in, and we loved the little house. And I went to work right away because I wanted to pay off his mother quickly. And there was an agent from the Occidental Life Insurance Company in Long Beach, and I went to work for him. And then And then, in the meantime, Frank was the youngest superintendent of open hearth furnaces that the Bethlehem Steel ever had before. And he was a graduate from Stanford University. And he thought about that job. It was good because what he had to do was being in charge of open hearth. He had to be there when the night shift came on at 7 o'clock at night. He didn't come home till at least 7. And then in the morning he had to be there by 7 so that the day shift could come on. And this went on and on. It was terrible, hard work for him, but he had a good job there. Anyway, this friend who sold heat bricks, high heat bricks to steel companies, told Frank he should quit the job and join them, which he did. He applied and he got the job. And the first thing that happened was we were transferred to Houston, Texas. And we rented our house. We didn't sell it because he said, if we don't like Houston, we'll quit the job and come back here to Long Beach. So we rented the place and we moved to Houston. We lived in an apartment.
What year was that?
We married in 1948. And so this might have been in 1949. Went to Houston, Texas. And he traveled as a traveling salesman, and he would go into Old Mexico, and since I had just moved there with him and didn't know anybody and wasn't working, I went with him into Old Mexico. We went over the border from Eagle Pass, Texas, into a place in Mexico called Piedras Negras, Black Stones. And there was a little steel plant there, and we had to stay in the manager of the steel plant there in his home because they did not have a motel or hotel in that little village. And he was a very nice Mexican fellow. He went to school in Texas. He spoke very good English, and his wife, Olga, was very nice to me. We enjoyed being together while my husband went with the superintendent of that steel plant and did their business there. And we stayed there a couple of days and then went on to another Mexican town called Monclova, and there was this American running the steel plant there, an older American and his wife. And they were very glad to see us because they were in a little village town and they didn't have any Americans there. And we were the only Americans that came to visit. Then after that, we went into Monterrey, which was a nice city. And then from there, we went on to Mexico City, which we enjoyed very much. And the steel plant there was run by 2 American young men. Their father came to Mexico from Syracuse, New York, and opened the steel plant when the 2 boys were still young kids. They came back to the States to retain their citizenship and then went to college and then came back to Mexico. And they took over the plant from the father because he was an old man then and soon died, and the 2 young men ran the plant. That's when my husband sold to them, enjoyed meeting them and their wives. And through them, we met another American couple who owned their home there and whose father had also come from the States and opened a plant there which made candles. And the man we met, the young man we met, was the son, and he took over the plant when the father died. And there are lots of Mexican churches in Mexico, Roman Catholic churches, that used a lot of candles. So apparently they did well with the candle factory. And that we stayed in Texas, Houston, Texas for 10 years. And after the first 5 years, my first daughter was born. And in fact, when
Time's up.
What about when you went to work for the Houston Post?
well, I'm coming to that, you
Oh,
see.
after we were born?
Of course.
Well, before that, can we go back and have you talk about
You were right. I had,
Frank and maybe just
His mom.
quickly touch on, his upbringing and then the school he went to and
well, okay.
how he came to be in the
Frank was born in El Paso. His father and mother came from New Jersey.
What were their names?
Her name was Hazel Harding, and Frank's father's name was Frank Aloysius Farrell from Ireland. He was from Ireland. And they were married, and they came from New Jersey. And Frank was born. His father traveled, and they moved from Jersey. And Frank was born in Texas, El Paso, Texas, somehow or other. And they were different. They lived in different states. I don't remember them. And Frank ended up in Long Beach, California.
His mom though was French, right?
No, not French. Mm-mm. His mother, I think, was half French. That's right, partly French, and English.
They were related to President Harding somehow.
Hazel Harding, his mother's family were descendants of the Warren Harding, the president. That's where that Harding name came from. Warren Gamaliel Harding. And that's all, never, the whole time I was married to your father, 45 years, never once did we talk about the Harding family, and didn't even know his uncle was a president till way later when, after he died. Your father's been gone 17 years. I think it was mentioned once that his, Warren Harding, yeah, that's why her name is Hazel Harding. That's why his middle name is Harding. Remember, you read his life, and it doesn't give anything about Hazel. But anyway, where was I now?
Houston.
Oh yes. Before my first daughter came. My first daughter came after 5 years in Houston, but before that, I met a woman in the next apartment house to where my husband and I lived. When we first moved to Houston, we got this apartment, and she worked for the Houston Post newspaper, and she said that the vice president, she said, his secretary's just left. See, she and I became friendly, and we chatted, and she found out that I used to be a secretary. She said, why don't you don't have anything to do, why don't you go and apply for the job? I said, that's a great idea. So I did go, and I had a car. I had learned to drive a car. I didn't drive before I married my husband, but after I married him, taught me how to drive and got me a car. And so after he joined this Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation, they supplied him with a car because he was a traveling salesman. He used to drive to call on his customers. And so therefore I got his car and learned how to drive. Anyway, so I went to call on this Houston Post newspaper, and I applied for the job. I was interviewed by the vice president of the paper. It's a small paper, Houston Post. And so he, after a little while, after a week or so, I actually got a call from him that I got a job. And he told me that I'd given him the name of the man I worked for in Los Angeles, Occidental Life Insurance Company, and he got in contact with the man in Los Angeles, and they gave him a good report on me. And in fact, the man in Houston said, I talked to him on the phone, and he said, he wished that you were back there. I said, oh, wonderful. So I worked for the vice president of the Houston Post, and there I met Mrs. Ovita Kalpabi and her husband, Hobby. What was his last name? I think. Okay.
Howard Baldwin?
No, Joseph, Jesse.
William Bettis, Hobby Jr.?
That's Junior, William Bettis.
He was the governor of Texas.
John, yes, he was. Twice governor of Texas, the man, and then Ovita Culp was his wife, and he became, when he finished his job as governor of Texas, he bought this newspaper. He started this newspaper in Houston.
Okay, we're back.
We're back. And William Pettis Hobby owned the newspaper that I worked for, and I worked for W. Howard Baldwin, who was the vice president right under the Hobbies. Mrs. Hobby was very active in the paper too, and she was a very clever woman. During the war, she was in the service, and she started the WACS program, Women's Auxiliary Corps, underneath Eisenhower. And when Eisenhower became president, he appointed her as Minister of Health, Education, and Welfare. And she left Houston, the paper, and went to Washington, D.C. But before she went, I had begun to work for her. She had her own secretary and an administrator, a woman who was her administrator. But then sometimes when they were flooded, I didn't have very much work to do with my boss, because being vice president, he delegated a lot of this work to different departments. But anyway, I would go to the Hobby homestead. There was a driver that drove us back and forth to the home and the office. And one time I sat by her bedside and she dictated 40 letters to me because she had received notes from friends praising her position that she got as Minister of Health and Welfare and so on. And this was before she was transferred to Washington, D.C., because she did have to go there. Anyway, I worked there and for a couple of years, and then I became pregnant, and then I had to quit work, and then I had Fran.
But Mrs. Hobby's husband was a governor of Texas?
Twice governor of Texas, and retired. Then he got this newspaper, became the owner of the newspaper. And then Mrs. Hobby, during the war, was head of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, and then under Eisenhower. And so then they became Republicans then, because Eisenhower was Republican. And that's when I became a Republican. I was a Democrat. I thought if Mrs. Hobby can be Republican, so can I. But anyway, I enjoyed working there, yes. And Mrs. Hobby was a fantastic woman. She had a daughter and a son, and they were both born on her birthday. Could you believe that? Mm-hmm. And so And then, how much older is your sister than you? 4.5
years, yeah.
When were you born?
58.
58. She was born in 50.
Mm-hmm.
Was it 53? Yeah. 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53. That's right. Yeah, I was married 5 years before Fran was born. 58. And you were born in when 58, 59, 60, 62?
I was born in 58.
58, excuse me. That's right, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. Yes, and then Felicia was born, and we were still in Texas, Houston, Texas then, Houston. And we had...
Houston?
Huh?
What part of Houston?
Houston is a town in Texas.
Yeah, I know. Which area did you live in?
Well, we were in this apartment house when Fran was born, and then when I became pregnant for the second child, we bought a house in outside of Houston. Golly, what's the name? What section is that? I forgot the section outside of Houston. I have the picture in my head. Oh dear. A forest, something forest. We lived on a street called Black Forest. No, I can't remember right now. But we got a house there, and we lived there for 5 years. And then we were transferred from Houston to
No, Mexico, Missouri.
Mexico. Oh yes, Frank came home one day and said, "Guess what? We've been transferred to Mexico." And I said, "Hooray!" I thought it was Mexico City. And he laughed and he said, "No, this is Mexico, Missouri. There's a town called Mexico, Missouri. Have you heard of that?"
No.
Brandon?
No.
I'd never heard of, I said, "Mexico, Missouri?" Yes. And so we moved into that town of 11,000 strong. That's all there were people there, 11,000. And they said to us, he said, you should join the country club there. My husband said, "Why would I join the country club just to have a few drinks?" And he said, "Well, because if you don't join the country club, you'll be bored stiff. And if you join the country club, you'll get stiff as a board." Actually, that was the only, and anybody who moved in there who knew anything or had anything joined the country club, because there's nothing else to do there, that little town. And so we lived there for about 3.5 years. And then, or a little longer. Well, then they moved us to Kansas City, Missouri. And Felicia, you went to a little preschool there, didn't you? Pre-kindergarten school there. And my husband went to pick her up one time when he had just come home from a trip. And they had a little test for the little kids there. Only pictures with, because they didn't know how to read yet. See, how old were you then, I wonder?
4.
At least 4, because we were in Kansas City. Fran was 8 years old in Kansas City, Missouri.
Well, I was 5 when we moved to California, so I was 4.5 or 5.
Yeah, we're 4 in Kansas City.
Yeah, I
Well,
did the test in California, but anyway.
Well, that's another test, but I'm beginning, this is not a reading test. And my husband picked her up, and when he came home, he said, Felicia was the highest one in the class there. And I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, they had pictures that they had to describe, and they showed Felicia and the rest of the kids that didn't say the same thing and was not correct. And they showed a picture of a child on a bed, but her head was at the foot of the bed, you know? And they showed the picture to the other kids and they said, oh, she's taking a nap. And when they came to this girl, Felicia, she said, well, the girl is on the wrong, she's taking a nap, but she's on the, she didn't hear what the other kids had said. She's lying down on the bed, but she's got her head on the wrong side of the bed. Should be up on the pillow side. The other kids said, oh, she, and then so she got high for that one. Then the second question she got first on was that a man was holding a toothbrush in his hand. And they all said, well, he's holding a toothbrush. But this one sees it, and she said, he has 6 fingers. They added a finger there, but the other kids never thought that. But she found the finger there. And the teacher told Frank that was terrific for a young kid like that.
All right, I gotta stop for a second here.
Yeah.
Real quick, Mom, that's most of your stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, just those last little names that aren't really on there.
Yeah. Will you tell us a little bit about Frank as a person and kind of
Yes.
tell us about what kind of a man he was and how people thought of him and
Yes.
what you thought of him?
Like in Mexico, those guys.
Yeah, like, I mean, even when you first met him and then up until...
Well, yes, you see, of course, I first met him, he was always very, very gentlemanly.
Sorry, can you just
And
start over and tell us who you're talking about?
this is Frank Farrell, my husband. When I first met him, it was on a blind date introduced to me by this girl I worked with in the Occidental Life Insurance Company in Los Angeles. And I didn't want to meet him at first, but she said not to worry. She said my family had known them for a long, long time. And when I finally met him, I liked him. And it was a funny thing, but I think we both liked each other at once because he never stopped seeing me once a week. He lived in Long Beach, I lived in Los Angeles. He came every Saturday. And then after a year of that, or a little more than a year of that, the county sent their health van to take our x-rays, I guess, to find out about tuberculosis or something. They took everybody's x-rays in the office. There were 6 floors of us, there were lots of employees. And they called me and said there was a spot on my right upper apex, lung apex.
You told us about that.
That part, yeah.
He kept visiting you for over a year, right?
For 17 months. And when they discharged me from the sanatorium, I told him to carry on with his own life, go on. And I was leaving the sanatorium and I was going to work there. And he wouldn't take that. And he said, we're getting married, period. That's it.
That must have been hard
That's,
for you to come up with, to tell him that even.
oh, I know. But I thought so much of him, and he was so good to come every week to see me and all that kind of stuff. And so, of course, I was thrilled when he said, we're going to get married, period. That's it. And you know the part about all that. Well, he was a he was a fine man, fine gentleman. And when he went from the plant to the Kaiser Aluminum Chemical Corporation, and he was a traveling salesman, he worked for them finally for about 30 years. And he did very well. They liked him, of course. And
Was he pretty likable?
everybody liked Frank. And he was a good-looking fellow, too. And they all liked him.
Why do you think everyone liked him?
Well, he had lots of friends. And,
But what about his personality you liked about him?
well, he was friendly fellow and fun fellow, and just happened to like him. That's all.
In Mexico, when he traveled?
Oh, he learned to speak Mexican, and they all liked him there too. Wherever he went, they all liked him.
What did they call him then?
Pancho. And when Fran was born and she grew up, I took her on the trips too. I used to pack the baby foods and the water and everything and took her with me. And then when she got to running around 3 years old or something like that, she still went there to Mexico with me. And they called her Panchita because the Mexicans added the ita at the end. The Mexican superintendent of the plant, his wife's name was Olga, and they had a girl who was about the same age as Fran, and they called her Olguita because her mother's name was Olga. And since Frank's name was Pancho, they called our little girl Panchita. Cute. Well, anyway, Frank went to, Stanford, and then to the military academy. John, what's the name of that? Anyway, he became a lieutenant junior grade, JG. And then he went into the service as a lieutenant, JG. And he was on a destroyer called the, you remember the name, Felicia?
Yes,
Cassin Young, thank you. I'm 91 years old now. I'm beginning to forget things. Cassin Young, he was on the destroyer, and they were twice kamikazed in South Pacific. They were in the South Pacific, twice kamikazed. And when we were transferred to Kansas City, Missouri, the girls were, Fran was about 8 and Felicia was about 4, right? And Frank came home one day and said that he was going to take us girls to the restaurant in the train station. The restaurant's called Harvey's. And they even made a movie with Judy Garland as a waitress at Harvey's. And he said, get dressed up, girls. I'm going to take the train to go to Oklahoma. He had to make a call there. Sometimes he drove to a city, and sometimes he had to fly, and so on. And so I got the girls dressed up, and I got dressed up in a dress, and we went to this restaurant. It was very nice. It was in the train station, and we sat in a booth, an open booth. I sat here and the 2 girls, and Frank over there and the 2 girls between us. And then in front of us, about 25 feet in front of us, was a table with a man sitting with his back to us and a woman across from him. And then on either side, a man and a woman, another man and a woman. And people would stop by and at this man whose back was facing us. And I said to my husband, he must be a movie star or something. And pretty soon he got up, and these 2 men got up with him, and they went that way. And shortly after that, they came back, and I looked and I saw, I could see in those days, I said, oh my gosh, that's President Truman. And of course, he lived in Independence, Missouri. This is Kansas City, Missouri, not far from Independence. And so he sat down again, and we were getting ready to go by that time. And I said to Frank, we got to stop and say hello to him. And I said to the girls, now when you see that man, we're going to say hello to him. You must say, hello, Mr. President. Hear me? Yes, Mommy, I heard you. Yes, Mommy. So off we went, and I pushed the girls to him, and he said, look what I have. Isn't that right, Felicia?
I don't remember.
You don't remember that? friend does. When I tell that story, she said she sat on his lap. Well, anyway, he said, look at this little girl. So he said, I don't have granddaughters, I have a grandson. And he said, now go over and say hello to Bess. And then I went up and I took his hand and I said, Mr. President, it's a privilege to shake your hand. He said, thank you, ma'am. And then when my husband went up to him, he said, sir, I was on a destroyer during the war on the South Pacific, and we were twice kamikazed. And when you dropped that bomb on Hiroshima, you saved my ass. He said, I'm glad I did, son. And after that, when I walked away I said to my husband, how could you say that to a president? He said, that's the one I could say it to. And the others, you couldn't say that. You wouldn't say that.
That's fun. All right, this card is full, so.
Right. My goodness, it's a long one, eh?
Yeah. That's all right. Stephen Jacob, what do you think?
I think Eli and Juno are probably destroying my room.
What's that? Oh dear. They're locked up there?
Yeah.
And I thought Jake was up there resting.
He was, but he came back down.
It's too long, eh? I've been talking too much?
No. No, not at all. I think he wants to know, like, when Grampy was, how he could talk to anyone and made friends with the man at the gas station. They ended up being your friends, Phyllis C. and Bob Singer. And remember how he
They
made
were
friends with the
from our church, darling,
well, he made
in New
friends with
Jersey.
he made friends with the mailman, and then he was so generous always.
He made
sent us out
friends.
everywhere.
He made friends with everyone.
Yeah.
They all liked him.
He always took us out everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Remember in New York when they had the parade, we went there. I forget, was it the Easter parade?
I don't know.
One time you went there and that comedian, Red Skelton, we bumped into him and we talked to him about that. Right. Let's see now, that part was,
Was Shanghai pretty?
nice city. Yeah. Well, lots of foreigners there, lots of foreigners.
Or Australia. Australia has lots of Asians.
See, I bought this vest in New Zealand. In 1990, your father and I were there. We went there. Bought this in 20 years ago. Didn't wear it much, but I'm wearing clothes over here.
You will, I know it's probably not easy, but try to maybe just in a couple words, a couple sentences, describe yourself and maybe
Him?
Grampy also, and
How we were together, huh?
yeah, that sounds, I like the way you put it.
Well, you see, he was a wonderful, wonderful man. Everyone liked him. And as a family man, he was very good. He took care of me, his wife, and his two girls very well, didn't he, Felicia? And he always thought of us and gave us good homes and care. And besides that, he was he traveled a lot in his business. And I used to be afraid to be alone. But then he had to go on his way. And I remember we finally were transferred to Oakland, California, and we stayed there. We were in Texas, we were in Mexico, Kansas City, Missouri, Oakland, California, and finally we were transferred to New Jersey. 5 different states we lived in. And in New Jersey, we were there for 18 years. The girls went through high school there and college there, and they got married. Both got married. Felicia met this boy in Greenville, South Carolina, when she went to the, what was the name of that school? Furman University. And she met this boy there at Furman, and he proposed to her. I think it was a week before graduation. He told her that he was going to go to the seminary after graduation to become a minister. And his father said to him, "Why did you wait so long to tell her that?" And he said if he told her that sooner, she would have run the other way. This is what you told me, friend, Felicia.
Yeah, we'll talk about you and Grant.
Yes, I'm coming to that. And so that she graduated and got married in New Jersey and left. And then the other daughter married and went to Florida and left. And Frank and I lived alone in New Jersey. He was retired then from his work. After 30 years, he retired. And Felicia moved to Greenville, South Carolina. He got a job. He graduated from seminary 4 years. Her husband got a job in Greenville. So we were transferred to Greenville. We sold the house in New Jersey, the old colonial home we used to call it, and we moved to a senior subdivision in Greenville, South Carolina called Swansgate. It was a lovely place. We each had a cute little house. We got a little ranch house, 3-bedroom ranch house, and or you could get a 2-bedroom house there. There were about 50 or 60 homes there, and we had a lovely clubhouse, very social. So we had a good time while we were there, and we joined a dance club. We met the other people there, and they got us to do things with them. Joined this dance club called the American Dance Club, and every Thursday we had 8 o'clock we met there, and we had a group lesson. There were several married couples in our group, and then from 8 to 9 we had a group lesson, dance class, and then from 9 o'clock to 11 it was party time, and everybody danced with everybody, and we loved dancing. I loved dancing. We had a good time dancing.
Great.
And so he was, jazz was, he was a, yes, jazz aficionado. He loved jazz.
This thing about football and kickers.
Oh, all the games he liked. Yes, he and the girls would watch all the football games,
I
and
remember watching ESPN with them.
yeah.
And then he'd walk and go pick up the groceries.
Yeah.
Who did?
That and the laundry. He'd walk down Swansgate to pick up the laundry.
And you said
Brandon was born.
you knew that?
Yeah, I remember seeing that. I remember watching ESPN with them.
You knew what Frank looked like?
Yeah, he was a lot. Dad saw Haley and Jay.
Oh, of course. What am I thinking
Brandon
of?
was 8.
Yes, of course, you were the grandchildren. Certainly you saw him. Right.
You think he would have liked to see Hudson?
Oh, he would have gone crazy.
He would have gone crazy.
He would just
watch the boys play football and baseball.
Oh my gosh,
He loved
yes.
baseball. They watched baseball every night.
Oh, great, yes. And he would love Hudson. Oh
And
gosh.
he loved jazz. He loved listening to them play their bands.
Oh my gosh, he would have gone crazy. And for to Haley singing, you know? Oh, he would have loved it. He would have loved you kids. Oh my gosh, yes. Well, then, of course, Greenville, that's when he got this disease of his liver. And that was from all the years of drinking. Being a salesman, you know, he had to entertain a lot, and that affected his liver, and that's what killed him. It was, and I remember that we were in Greenville then, and I saw him. I was sitting in the den there, and the door was open, and there's a hallway, and right across from the doorway was the second hallway bathroom, and the door was open, and he was standing up there, and he was spitting out. In fact, he was vomiting, and the stuff that I saw coming out was black. And I jumped up and I said, I'm going to call the doctor. And I called the doctor, and doctor said, take him to the emergency room hospital right away. And the hospital was near us, and he named it. So I took him there, and Frank said, I don't want to go there because I won't come out. And I said, don't be silly. And so I found out later that any blood that you spit out from your mouth looks black, but the other way would be red. Anyway, so I took him there, and immediately they took x-rays of him. The doctor came there, took x-rays of him, and then they took him to a private room upstairs. And I slept there the first night. No, I had to go home the first night. I didn't have my clothes. And that was Saturday night. And Sunday night, after church, I went there, and he was dressed, sitting there eating his breakfast, but he didn't eat. I started to feed him, and it wasn't good because he couldn't keep it. And then I brought my night clothes that night, Sunday night, and about 10 o'clock that night, the nurse came to give him some medication, and he spat it all up, and they came quickly. In the emergencies, they checked him, and they had to put him in a ICU. What is that? Intensive care unit. So he went, and I told the nurse, I said, well, I'll I was in my nightgown already. I'll put on my slacks and I'll come. She says, you put on your slacks and bring everything out of this room and call your daughters. And so I remember I called you. It was at night, and Felicia had to call her neighbor to come and sit with the kids, and she and Scott came to the hospital, and Fran came by herself. And we stood there for 18 hours, I remember, because we stood there all Sunday night, and then it went into Monday.
Well, he died 4th of July.
I know, that was...
I didn't come up until...
That was 1 o'clock.
4th of July, because
No, you were in the ICU room with me and Fran, and Scott was there. Scott was praying over him, and you two girls would go up and kiss him and then talk to him and everything. And I was, and there was a little TV screen.
The thing had died.
TV screen, and it had white arrows going up and down. And the nurse said, when the arrows don't go anymore and it's just a straight line, means he's dead. And I went up to him. Finally, I went up to him and I said, listen, sweetie, you are very tired. And I said, I want you to go to sleep. And I said, you know, I'm not afraid anymore at Swansgate. We know everybody there, and I'm fine. And I want you to go to sleep because you're so tired. And you know what? A few minutes after that, Felicia said, look, Mom, it's straight. Yeah. He died because he knew I wasn't afraid anymore. I think that's the truth. That's the end of the story. That's the end of my story. He didn't want to leave me because he was afraid I was afraid. then I said to him, I'm not afraid anymore, you know. We know everybody at Swansgate. So that's the story, Brandon.
Very good.
What else did you want me to say?
That's it.
That's how he was.
We'll pick up more next time.
What else?
We'll get more next time.
Yeah? Well, tell me what else you want to know. I'll tell you now. He was a good.
Good.
He enjoyed dancing, and so when he retired, we didn't dance at all when he was working because there was too much traveling to do. But anyway,
He was like a combination of these boys. He
We-
loved jazz, he loved
yes,
music,
he loved-
opera, he loved
loved,
ballet,
yeah.
he loved
oh yes,
athletics, he
everything.
loved he was a beach bum. He could
You-
on the
you
beach
see,
and go back.
He took me to his jazz things, and I took him to the opera and the ballet.
And he
stuff,
could body
right.
surf better than anyone. you
Oh,
ever knew.
he was a good swimmer, and the girls were good swimmers.
He was a fireman in college to work his way through college.
Oh, he served at the dining room.
But he was a fireman also at Stanford.